So I just wanted to do a quick video talking about a common misconception that can occur with while loops. So I want to very quickly talk about this misconception, why it's a misconception, and how they actually work. Okay. So before we get into while loops, it's important to understand how scripts are executed. So they are executed from top to bottom. So I have a startup script here that has 3 lines. Line 1 is loading your map. Line 2 is setting the player's HP stat. And line 3 is setting a global property. Okay. And once this script has reached line 3 and done whatever is on that line, in this case setting a global property, it then stops. And unless you have events that are frequently triggered, so an example of that might be, if we go into game configuration, global event scripts. If you put this script, for example, on character enters a tile, then every time any character, NPC or player, moves around, then this script, if it's assigned to that event, will always fire. So every time a character moves around, it's going to load map overworld, set the player's HP to 20, and set a global property. In this case, we're using the startup script. And startup, as you know, is a script you assign in game configuration to the startup as the startup script. So startup scripts only get executed once at the start of the game. Once this script reaches, in this case, line 3, and has finished doing all the things it is set to do, it then finishes, it's done, it ends. And it's because it's the startup script, it's never called again, unless, as I say, you have other events that triggered this particular script, which normally for a startup script you wouldn't do. So let's say, for example, you wanted to set up a scenario where while you're playing the game, if your health ever drops below, let's say 10, then it adds 1 to your health every second until it's 10 again. So what we could do is in our startup script, because we want this to start at startup, right? We want this to happen at the beginning of the game. We would say while player.stat HP less than 10 do player.stat HP plus equals 1, and then wait 1, and then end. So there's our very simple while loop that basically says while our health is less than 10, add 1 to it every second until it's, until it's not less than 10. So the misconception is that this is going to always check the player's health until it's less than 10. That's actually not what's going to happen. This is the misconception. So let me explain what's actually going to happen, why that happens, and then how you resolve it. So what's going to happen at the start of the game, the order of execution is the game's going to start. You're going to click new game. This script is going to run. So it's going to start at line 1. It's going to load the map, which it does. It's then going to set your HP to 20, which it will do. As long as, you have a maximum allowed HP of 20, it will then set that to 20. It then sets this global property on line 3, game started, to true. It will do that. Then it reaches line 4, and it reads that, and it says, while player stat HP less than 10. Now, at the start of the game, it's not. It's 20. Now, it doesn't matter whether we're setting 20 in the script or whether we set it in the voxel editor. It doesn't matter. If the player starts with 20 health, either by the startup script or just putting it on the model directly, the point isn't that it's in this script. The point is that the player's health starts at the beginning of the game at 20. So what's going to happen is your script in startup is going to reach line 4, and it's going to see that that's not relevant, because while player stat HP less than 10, it's not less than 10, it's 20. So what your script then does is it ignores line 5, and it ignores line 6, and it gets to line 7, and it ends. So effectively what happens is none of this, lines 4 to 7, do anything. Why? Because your health is not less than 10. When you then play your game, let's say you start walking around the map, you start fighting enemies, and they knock your health down to 9, let's say. So now it is less than 10. This still isn't going to do anything, because once this script ends, like I said at the very beginning, it's never called again unless you have other events in the game, like character enters tile, that are frequently calling this script. Once startup finishes, it's done. Even if there's a while loop inside, if it didn't do the while loop, then it's done, and that while loop is never used again. Let's say we change this. Let's say we set the player's health to 5 at the start of the game. So this while loop is valid. What happens then? When you start the game, it will load the map. It will then set the HP to 5. It will then set the global property. And then it will reach line 4. And it will check the HP. And it will see that it is less than 10. So it will now go down to line 5. And it will add 1 to that number. So now your stat is 6. It then waits a second. It does the next thing in the while loop, which is to wait a second. And then it gets to the end, but before it ends, it checks the loop again. It checks the conditions of the loop, and it sees it's still not able to end because 6 is still less than 10. So then it goes down to line 5 again, and it adds 1. So now it becomes 7, and then it waits another second. Before it ends, it checks the condition again, sees it's still not able to end. So it goes down to line 5, and it adds 1, so it becomes 8. And then it waits a second, and then it tries to end, but checks the condition. Now it can't because it's still less than 10. So it goes down to line 5 again, adds 1, so it becomes 9, etc. Waits, ends, but it can't because it's still less than 10. So it goes down to line 5, it adds 1, and now it is 10. So it waits a second, and then it gets to this line, and it checks. Oh, okay, it's now 10. I no longer need to do any of this, so it ends. Same thing again. Startup is never called again, so this while loop will never happen again other than the start of the game. So if in this case we're saying start the game with 5 health, and if our health is less than 10, add 1 to it until it's not less than 10, and then end. So what we've essentially made is a startup script that at the beginning of the game heals us from 5 to 10. And then never gets run again. Because once a script ends, unless it's assigned to an event which is constantly triggered, which startup isn't, it's only triggered once at the startup, then it will never happen again. So it's really important to understand that while loops, the condition that you put in the while loop only gets triggered once. Okay, so scripts get triggered from top to bottom, and as it's doing that, when it hits a while loop, if the condition is not valid, so in other words, if our health was 20 and we're checking for less than 10, then it just won't do the while loop, and it will end your script because it will have gone linearly from top to bottom and then end. And unless that script is on an event which is going to constantly re-trigger that script, you'll never have that while loop happen again. If you have a script where when it gets to the while loop it is valid, it will do the loop until it's done the condition, so in other words, until it's then not less than 10, at which point it will then end the script and the same rules apply. It's executed, it's done its job, it's finished, and it never runs again. So this is why you need to create what are called forever loops. This is why they're a thing. How do we actually achieve what we want to achieve, which is all the time check? It doesn't matter if it's the start of the game, 5 minutes into the game, an hour into the game, at the end of the game. Whenever our health drops below 10, heal it by 1 until it's 10. How do you do that? Let's set this to 20. You don't do it this way. You have to say while true do, And what this is basically saying is we're not giving it a condition. We're not saying while player stat HP less than 10 or while global property is equal to false. We're just saying while true. And that basically means while just do it, just all the time. And so what will happen now in between this while and this end is this code. Basically what we're doing is we're trapping our startup code within lines 4 and 8. It's never going, our startup, we've basically told our startup script to never end. It's just going to constantly be trapped within lines 4 and 8, doing 5, 6, and 7 over and over and over and over and over and over again, right? So then what we can do is we can change our code within the while loop to be if player.stat HP less than 10, then player.stat HP plus equals 1, end the if, put a wait of a second. Okay, so what this script's going to do now is it's going to do line 1, it's then going to do line 2, it's then going to do line 3, and it's going to hit line 4, and because it's got no ending condition, it's now going to be valid, because while true, well, it's true. It basically means do this, and because there's no actual condition that can then be made false, because it's just a generic true, it then has to do 5, 6, 7, and 8 all the time, forever. There's no way to stop it. So what it's then going to do is it's then going to check if player stat is less than 10, then add 1 to it, wait a second. If player stat less than 10, add 1 to it, wait a second, all the time, throughout your entire game. Start of the game, an hour into the game, halfway into your game, it's still going to be doing this thing. But in essence, what you're doing is you're basically saying the startup script will never end. It will still be, this script will still be running. It will still be ticking away because while true, as I say, it doesn't have an ending to it. So your script, as I say, at this point, will just be forever looping between 5, 6, 7, and 8, 5, 6, 7, and 8, 5, 6, 7, and 8, because it can never end, because true is always going to be true. It's just by its nature. You're not saying something is true. You're just saying while true. Well, true is always true. It's true. You know. You could, another thing you could do is you could say while 1 is equal to 1. You know, it just is. You know, so you're basically saying this can never be made false. Okay. It's why one of the best things to do is to not actually do a complete forever loop, but to, for example, have a global property that you set at the start. So you might have, for example, we might change this, instead of game started, we could use while looping, let's say, is true. And then we could say while global dot property looping is equal to true, do, and because we're setting it to true, it will then keep constantly, it will act like a while loop, a forever loop, because as long as you never set this at any point to false, then this will just always tick in your game. But the nice thing about doing it this way is there is a way for you to stop it if you need to. At some point you can set the global property looping to false, and then it will stop this loop. Whereas while true, there's no way to stop it because there's no condition. It's just while true, you know. But this is how you actually do constant loops, because you've got to remember that scripts, once they end, unless they're constantly triggered by events that constantly trigger things, like, for example, walking on tiles or on hit maybe. So every time you hit something with a projectile, it might re-trigger this script, but it's not always just always running. You have to sort of trigger it, okay? Whereas what we're doing here is we are setting our startup to never end. And therefore, it is always running in the background, and it is always checking the player's health is less than 10, or whatever it is you want to check. So this may be health, or it might be, if a global property is something, or if a quest has been completed, or whatever. But this is how you have constantly running checks in place. This will stop this code from ending and will always run. So unless you give it a generic check, a condition, or have something in place where it can never be made untrue unless you specify it is, then if you give it an in-game condition like while player stat HP less than 10, unless that's valid at the time that the while loop gets triggered, then it may not even do the while loop, and then your script will end. And even if it is valid, it will only be valid until it's no longer valid, i.e. in the example of 5, where it added 1 until it was 10, but then it ends because it's then no longer valid. So the script will then end at that point. Whereas this while loop can't end because true can never be made not true. So your code will now forever be looping between 5 and 8. And therefore, that's where you can then have code where throughout your entire game, something is happening. Okay? So that's how while loops actually work. So it's important to understand that putting a while loop in a script isn't automatically going to make it always check, always check, always check. What it actually does is it just makes that specific part of the code loop for as long as the condition in the while loop is valid. And if it isn't valid, it won't even do the loop. So if you want something to check all the time, you need a much more generic or something that you can set that will always be, this condition will always be valid, rather than the thing you're actually wanting to check for. You should do that inside the while loop as an if. So while you're forever looping, if the health ever drops below 10, then add 1 to it until it's not. So this will always fire, but this one will only fire if the health is less than 10. So your game is forever going to be checking this if every second, but it may not do the code that's inside the if the health isn't less than 10, right? But it will always be checking that every second because this while loop is just going to forever go round and round and round, okay? So I hope that sort of cleared up a little bit about how while loops work, the misconception about them that they're always working if you put them in a script, and why they're not re-triggering if you've, got them in scripts. Just remember that unless you are making a forever loop, they're not going to always run, okay? Unless they're either in scripts that are constantly being triggered, like scripts on, enters tile or something, or unless you make it a while loop in your startup script, a forever loop in your startup script, they're not going to always be running, okay? So it's a really important thing to understand, and I hope that was clear in this video. If you have any questions about it, then obviously do feel free to ask. But hopefully this has made sense. So with that said, that'll wrap up this video. Thanks for watching.